Let's take a look at who our winner is for this week. So my spreadsheet is a little bit large and unwieldy. I have found that it's easier to just copy and paste a whole lot of data from the game into the spreadsheet that I've built, as opposed to just picking out the particular numbers that I need. So I've copied and pasted actually three different deals, three different financial things from the capstone or from the capsim, and I pasted into my Excel worksheet here. And then I build my scoring matrix, which is down here a little ways. And I scroll down, and I scroll down a little more, and so here I am at the scoring matrix, and for the most part you can kind of ignore a lot of this stuff up on top. I don't use most of it. I rely on about 6 different things. And then there's some stuff on the left that you can also ignore. I kind of use that in some formulas to build my scores. So let's take a look at it. See, I've got all 6 teams there, if you're looking at the very bottom now, kind of. So for the earnings per share, which, once again, I score as the highest. And somebody might ask, why profits? Well, because profits are profits, and that has nothing to do with what I, as a shareholder, might get. And how to explain that. There are some large companies that make very big profits, but their earnings per share may not be all that exciting because they have a lot of shares outstanding, perhaps. Okay, but I hesitate here. I've got to back up a little bit and say, trying to compare earnings per share in the real world is not wise. Okay, we can only do it in this game because you guys all start from an even point. In the real world, it's crazy. You can't compare earnings per share. And maybe when I'm done here, I'll talk about that a little bit more. That's because you don't know how many shares are outstanding, the type of company, on and on and on. And again, I'll take a look at maybe some examples when I'm done here. So, Team Andrews and Team Chester, our computer team, was just behind. The next thing I score on is ROE. Well, these are kind of related, but not exactly. A little bit of difference. ROE is return on equity. Once again, geez, how come profit's not in there yet? Well, because like the earnings per share, the equity, if I'm a shareholder, the equity is my portion of the company. That's my net worth, whatever share of that I might have. That's my net worth in the company. Okay, and so I'm interested in what the return is on my net worth in the company. Once again, profit can be misleading, perhaps. Okay. The next one's contribution margin, and I score this one high. This one has less to do with the shareholder, but I score this one high because it's so important. If you listen to the video that I made, the recap of the round, you'll see the emphasis that I put on contribution margin. I just think that it's what you need to really push in order to make profits. Now, if you're analyzing maybe a public company outside of our game here, gross margins is probably what you would look at, which is similar to the contribution margin. In most of ours, it's going to be what they would call is you'd have sales, and then you'd have cost of goods sold, and you'd have gross profit, which in a dollar sense, or gross margin in a percentage sense. And so that's what you'd look at, and that's what would be comparable. They call it contribution margin here. And I think that's because they break out the material cost and the labor cost, which oftentimes you wouldn't see in the basic financial statement of a public company. So there you go. And Andrews still, look at that, they've gotten the high score. It's 30 possible for earnings per share. It's 25 possible for ROE, the return on equity, and it's 10 points possible for the contribution margin. Stock price and the stock price change. Okay, Once again, as a shareholder, I'm kind of interested in what's happening with stock price. And in this case, Chester stock price jumped up a little bit higher. Me as a shareholder, I'd probably question that. I'd probably look at it and say Andrews is a better value because Andrews had higher earnings per share and higher ROE, and I'd be concerned that Chester sold some stock. When Chester sold stock, they diluted my interest. Whenever a company sells stock, they dilute the interest of the current shareholders. And instead of having all the equity and the profits dispersed over 2 million shares, all of a sudden they may be dispersed over 2.2 million shares. It's like a 10% hit that I'd be taking as a shareholder. Okay. Next on the list is profits. I do score profits, and you see Chester scored well there. BGEN 10-point max on this one. And I like profits. There's nothing wrong with that. And as a shareholder, I'm concerned about profits. I certainly want my company to be profitable, but I just don't score it as highly as I do earnings per share and ROE. Cash flow, and cash flow is more of a safety thing, I guess you would say. I like companies that can generate decent cash flow because it's less risky. Okay, it's less risky. And so cash flow is something that gets talked about often, and this is probably going to be more of an operational cash flow as opposed to cash flow you get by finance, because if you look at Ferris, they ended up with by far the most cash. Okay, but they didn't necessarily generate that cash from operations. They generated it from borrowing money and issuing a lot of stock. Okay? And those aren't necessarily the things that I want to look at when I'm considering cash flow. Lastly is strategy. Okay, strategies, that's my subjective one. Often, the only time I've probably used it is when I've used it as a tiebreaker, maybe, if we get that. I'll generally score you okay unless you completely get off base with your strategy. And of course, in this case, I haven't asked you to give me your strategy yet, so my error. But hopefully, you guys will give me your strategies, and then these will count. So, okay, then below that, it's going to give us a subtotal. Let's call it. And at this point, Andrews is clearly ahead, even beating the computer team, which I will say is a bit of a pleasant surprise. So we bounce down, and then this next category is things that you can lose points over. Sometimes we'll get a team that wins the subtotal, but they lose the total because they lose points, because maybe they got an emergency loan. Okay, and my emergency loan threshold, by the way, is $5 million, and I've thought about prorating this. I could change my formulas, take a little bit of work, because obviously, the smaller an emergency loan, the less relevant it is, but the bigger it is, the more relevant it is. And again, it's a risk thing. I mean, a loan is a loan. An emergency loan, means poor planning, and so you get fined, I guess, or deductions for poor planning. But whether you got an emergency loan or a short-term loan, say the ultimate difference isn't that great. Emergency loan is going to cost you a little bit more because you get penalized. So that's the reason for the deduction. Again, I've thought about prorating it, but I haven't. Leverage. The leverage, and that's from right up on the top of the financial page, and I'll show you that. Let's see, I can come up here and show you. Leverage is right here. Assets divided by equity is how they calculate it. It's a little different than what I'm used to. We used to do a debt to equity type of a ratio, which we like to see at least 1 to 1. But they use assets divided by equity, and it really means the same thing. It's just a different way to look at it, and it takes a little bit of getting used to from my standpoint, just because it's a little different than what I grew up with in banking. But my threshold here, everybody's got some leverage, right? Okay, but my threshold here then is 2.25, and sort of kind of drawn out of the hat, but not totally. In other words, it's probably a number that I've chosen from past experience and whatnot, looking at companies. And so some leverage is good. And again, you can be highly leveraged and be very, very successful. Okay, you could easily win around and have too much leverage, and part of the reason is if you got a lot of leverage, your equity is low, and it will make it easier for you to have a higher ROE, which I score as a very important factor, right? Okay, you may buy back a lot of stock, which can lower your equity, which would increase your leverage, which, okay, again, I score earnings per share is very important. You might end up getting some, deductions for having too much leverage, but, I've seen a lot of teams that have won and yet still had deductions for leverage. Ideally, I suppose you want to kind of push that limit, that 2.25 limit. And then lastly, you could get a deduction for working capital. Working capital is a $20 million thing. I want you to have working capital of at least $20 million. And what's the definition of working capital? Current assets minus current liabilities, right? So your current assets are your cash, your inventory, and your accounts receivable minus your accounts payable and your short-term liabilities. And so those should be at least $20 million. And again, that just goes to risk. If they're less than $20 million, you're a little more risky, and so you kind of get penalized for that. So we get to a grand total, and in this case, Andrews is the victor. So Andrews gets to not do the assignment for round one. Congratulations, Team Andrews. Just one quick thing. If you bounce ahead, you'll notice I've got scores and stuff from here, and that would be from prior games that were played, and I just haven't gone in and gotten rid of those. It's actually easier if I leave them because then I know where to paste my new information and whatnot. So don't look ahead because it's meaningless. But you can look at round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 practice rounds, and then we'll start the competitive rounds here. Those go through round 8. So that's it for the spreadsheet. I probably won't talk a lot about this one in the future. I'll probably really quickly, now that I've explained it, I'll get right to the scoring and show you who is the winner, and maybe point out why. But I'll probably do that in just a normal video. So don't expect to have to listen to lengthy videos about this in the future.